Hey guys, I just wanted to take a minute to go through this homework assignment that you had to make sure that you have understood this document. This is one of your 9 foundational documents, so it really is important that you understand really what it's about. So we'll go through question by question and find our answers in the text in the left-hand column. So first, what would be examples of God-given and constitutional rights African Americans were waiting for? Right? Dr. King says we've waited for more than 340 years, referring back to even to colonial America before the Revolution and before the Declaration. So what is it that he's saying that African Americans are waiting for? I think first of all, one practical thing, of course, would be the right to be able to vote freely without interference by state governments. Remember, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had been passed right after the Civil War. And here Dr. King was almost 100 years later, and African Americans were still in many ways being disenfranchised, being kept from voting. Probably more broadly than that, he's just talking here about the right to be treated equally, to enjoy equal protection of the law, to not be discriminated against, to not be kept segregated racially. So the right to be able to, eat at restaurants with whites, the right to be able to go to movie theaters, to hotels, water fountains, things like that, to have equal protection of the law, equal rights, equal access, regardless of race. So that's probably a more broad answer there. Second question, what's it called when people break a law on purpose in order to highlight or to draw people's attention to the injustice of that law? This was something that was in your notes, I believe. Just in case it wasn't, the term we're looking for here is civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, C-I-V-I-L, civil disobedience. This was what the civil rights movement used again and again and again in order to draw America's attention to unjust laws. They said the only way that we can get people to see the wrong that is going on in these situations is to break the law, and then to show how law enforcement responds to that with, beatings, fire hoses, sicking dogs on them, arresting them, things like that. And then for those who are being treated this way, to resist peacefully, to actually accept, being put into jail wrongly. They were doing all of these things to draw attention to the fact that, yes, we know this is a law, but it's an unjust law. So civil disobedience is the term there. Next, it says highlight answers to the following questions in the text. What does King consider a just law? A just law meaning a right or a fair and appropriate law. What does he consider to be a just law? We'll look down here. He says, what's the difference between the two? How do we determine when a law is just or unjust? He says, a just law is a man-made code, so, a civil law, that squares with, that agrees with the moral law, or the law of God. So what does King consider a just law? One that agrees with, he says, the moral law, the law of God. He's suggesting there is a higher law than human laws, something that is above it, and that human laws need to agree with it in order to be just. So what does he consider an unjust law? He says an unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law, that higher law, the law of God. So guys, that's really a critical thing for you to understand. Is King's arguments during the civil rights era, he was trying to show people that these human laws were wrong, and that everybody knew that they were wrong, that there was something inside of them that said this is not right. He was appealing to people's conscience, to a moral law above what human beings might legislate. So why was he arrested? Next question. He says, I was arrested Friday on a charge of parading without a permit. Holding a political march. That's why he was arrested. Why was he willing to break the law? He says the ordinance is used to preserve segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and peaceful protest. It has become unjust. So again, he's willing to break it because he understands there's a higher law, and he needs to draw attention to the injustice of the human law. Why does he feel African Americans will share, like he feels certain they will share in the American ideals that Jefferson stated in the Declaration? Why does he feel so sure about that? He says, before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we, African Americans, were here. Before the pen of Jefferson scratched across the pages of history the majestic word of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. He says the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us. So the opposition we now face will surely fail. So one answer here would be because African Americans have always persevered, and so he assumes they will continue to. But probably more importantly, he says we will win our freedom because, why? The sacred heritage of our nation. So all of the freedoms and liberty which America says it believes in from the beginning, he says he thinks that's actually going to come through. America will come through on those freedoms and liberties that it has always promised, right? We believe that all men are created equal. Martin Luther King Jr. actually believed that. He believed that the ideals in America's founding documents were actually true, and that it was a matter of time only before all Americans would enjoy them. He says, we will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. In other words, what they were asking for, what they were calling for, the changes they were trying to make, God approves of them, that they are right, that they are true, and that God himself is behind their cause. Okay. As for the rest of these answers, of course, these are things for you to fill in. I'm not going to give you the answers for all those. So number one, you have to come up with an example. Number two, you have to come up with an example. Number three, how were African American rights restricted in the 1800s and 1900s, voting rights specifically. That, of course, there are specific answers to that from your notes. And number four, again, this is something you have to explain yourself. All right, hope that was helpful.